Do you want to avoid the most common pitfall when it comes to interface design? Well, stick around and I'll show you why a good use of spacing is crucial to creating a high quality UI. If there's one thing to take away from this video, it should be that a strong use of spacing can mean the difference between a low quality and a high quality interface. So how do we achieve this in practice? You want people to see the relationship between elements so they can quickly understand how to interact with your product, right? Well, understanding how and why things are positioned in relation to each other is the key to unlocking that. So what's the best approach? An effective technique that I use is to take a section of the UI and add in all the content for that area to make sense. It's really helpful if you can get hold of content that best reflects what the end user will see. You can then start to build relationships between these elements and create chunks of content that will help you determine how much spacing to use. By referencing the law of proximity, we know that elements that are placed close together are perceived as related, and those that are placed further away relative to everything else are perceived as loosely related. Knowing how to group content is determined by the types of data you're displaying and how well they work together to help the user find what they need. For example, you might group a header and subheading together, the main body text and a link to show more, then end with a group for metadata and additional information. This is a fairly simplified example, but if you break the content down far enough, you'll often find that the same patterns will emerge time and time again. Once you have this in place, you can start to add spacing between each chunk. Chunking is actually a proven UX technique that means breaking up content into small, distinct units of information. Pro tip: add more spacing than you think you'll need in the beginning. You can always reduce this as you refine your design later. This is often much easier to manage than if you were to keep adding small amounts of white space over and over. Don't worry too much about the specific pixel values just yet. Stick around and we'll go through that later in the video. Once you've set a base level of spacing between your chunks, now we turn our attention to the space within the content chunks. It's at this point you should start to see the benefit of adding a generous amount of spacing between these chunks, as this gives you more room to play with when spacing out the specific lines of content. At this point, you should start seeing some level of clarity appear around your content, even if the spacing seems fairly excessive. This is actually a good thing. It means it's time to tighten things up and start to think more about the system you're going to use for laying things out. If you know me at all, you won't be surprised to hear that I highly recommend using the 4-point grid system for pretty much everything when it comes to interface design. This of course means we'll be using multiples of 4 to arrange the chunks of information within our UI. When you hear the term grid system, you might get visions of multiple vertical lines going across your interface. While this can be useful to check margins and gutters for the overall layout of a design, the grid system I'm talking about here is more of what we would call an implicit grid. This essentially means it's implied that everything is vertically and horizontally spaced out using multiples of 4. Turning on a visual grid overlay in this case can be overkill and actually more of a distraction. Modern design tools make this super easy to handle, as you can adjust your nudge values to the increments of the system you're working to. In this case, I keep the small nudge value to 1 pixel and the large to 4. Once you're ready to start applying the values in your grid system, the first thing I'd suggest to make life easier for you going forward is to round your current spacing values to the nearest value in the system. In this case, we'd go from 65 to 64 and 27 to 28. If you're using Figma, this will make adjustments much smoother, as we can simply drag while holding the Shift key and snap to accurate increments of our grid. When it comes to settling on appropriate values, I tend to take a single chunk and start spacing out the content within. This is because it allows me to use this next technique. use double the inner chunk spacing for the outer chunk spacing. Now, this is a rule of thumb that can help you start to build hierarchy and separation, but I encourage you to take this rule and break it so that it fits the style of your own interface. I typically start with this rule, then adjust by 1 or 2 steps in the 4-point scale. While we're only looking at a small part of an interface here, if you consistently apply this same technique to each area of your product design, the results will come. The chunking, spacing, and doubling approach can be used in any part of your interface, including tables, forms, dashboards, and cards. As you scale this up, you can make reuse much easier throughout by using components that each have your spacing system baked into them. Remember, it doesn't really matter which values you use for your base spacing. Just make sure you are using them consistently, and over time, you'll start to produce higher quality interfaces. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next one.